9 days before Christmas in 2023, fire services were scrambled to Killigill House in the pastoral village of Roscahill in Connemara, a beautiful tourism spot in the west of Ireland. It was built in 1863 by an Anglo-Irish landlord, and the historic house was set ablaze after more than a week of protests, which saw locals barricade roadways to the house with felled trees, tractors, and so on. Word had spread throughout the village, close-knit community of 300 people, that 70 immigrant men of unknown origins were to be placed in a disused hotel under the government's International Protection Accommodation Scheme, IPAS. The next day, after the fire, Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, Micheál Martin, denounced the burning. He tweeted out, quote, "There is never any excuse or place for violence, hatred, or intimidation. Those responsible for this criminal act do not speak for their community or the country." The Prime Minister at the time, Leo Varadkar, added, quote, "There is no justification for violence, arson, or vandalism in our republic, ever." Now, as defiant as Varadkar and Martin were in the wake of this Killigill House burning, a simple fact remained. Killigill House had survived the ravages of the Irish War of Independence, the Irish Civil War, which saw 300 Anglo-Irish landlord houses burnt out. But it couldn't survive the first coalition government of Ireland's self-proclaimed centrist parties. And the idea with this fire, the idea that the Republic of Ireland could be plunged into a civil war was, for the first time in a century, a very real and distinct possibility, certainly for the first time in my life. So how do we get to this point? As of August 2024, there were at least 31 fires at proposed or rumoured IPAS centres across Ireland. Most of these were in Dublin, with the majority of the fires reported between 2023 and mid-2024. The escalation in arson at these sites was matched by the state in their use of violence to put down demonstrations close to centres. Tensions flared because the government enacted a no consultation and no veto policy of forcing large groups of mainly Arab and African men claiming refugee status into historic close-knit communities. Communities were left with no legal recourse, and it was not uncommon for buses of immigrants to arrive in the middle of the night and for communities to wake up with their demographics completely and utterly changed. The totalitarian and utterly undemocratic actions of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael backed locals into a corner. And in some cases, that resulted in those locals taking desperate actions. Sadly, what ended up as a fiery standoff between the people and the state had begun as a touching moment of solidarity. In 2022, the Irish government offered the most generous social benefits in the EU to Ukrainians who are fleeing the war with Russia. For example, refugees were given a weekly stipend of €232 with accommodation and other benefits, which was the same as the job seekers' rate for unemployed Irish people. Now, in comparison, Hungary offered €13.79 per week. Because of this extraordinarily generous offer, by January 2024, Ireland had welcomed more than 100,000 Ukrainian refugees fleeing the conflict. And we were accepting them at a rate 10 times the EU average throughout 2023. To accommodate these staggering numbers for a small island like Ireland, the state's apparatus or accommodation capabilities were completely overwhelmed. And so the government offered eye-wateringly lucrative contracts to private hoteliers to put these refugees up. Placing the refugees in hotels had a dramatic effect on communities along the western seaboard, where I come from, who are disproportionately dependent upon tourism for economic survival. As of February 2024, all of the top 10 towns or villages with the most Ukrainian refugees in Ireland were located in the western seaboard. The Irish Tourism Industry Confederation in 2022, at the end of 2022, estimated that 28% of all tourism beds outside of Dublin had been contracted by the government to house Ukrainians. And that same organisation estimated that €1 billion would be lost to the Irish tourism sector in 2023, which it was, and again in 2024. The extraordinary sums of money that were given to private hoteliers were such that by May 2024, a local paper, the Clare Echo, reported that private individuals were buying up properties in North Clare with the express interest of leasing them out to the government to the detriment of the wider local economy. When the government offered vast sums of tourism accommodation to tourism accommodation providers to give beds to asylum seekers, not only did they make those providers unimaginably wealthy overnight, but they deprived non-accommodation tourism providers of paying customers, thus killing the wider industry. And this put unimaginable financial strain on people in towns like Lisdoonvarna in my home county, where the economy is largely based around summer tourism, like food, drink, entertainment, sightseeing, and shopping, so on. These were completely killed. It created an entirely new class system also, with pockets of extreme wealth and extreme subsistence overnight. The dual shock of losing your livelihood and seeing accommodation providers, former neighbours, made arbitrarily wealthy, unimaginably wealthy, is a recipe for disaster and conflict in small communities. This was a pattern that had emerged across the country as a new class of hoteliers had become extremely powerful. And all of this at the expense of the Irish taxpayer. In total, €2.1 billion was paid out to IPAS accommodation in 2023 alone. In May of 2023, the Irish Times, a national newspaper, reported that the government policy of using tourism accommodation to house refugees had cost 10,000 tourism jobs nationwide to that point. Clare's biggest town, again my home county, Innis, had lost 15.4 million in tourism income and 415 jobs. World famous Killarney, the jewel in the crown of Irish tourism, home to 2,575 Ukrainians, lost 100 million and 2,722 jobs. That's nearly as many Irish tourism jobs displaced as there were Ukrainians coming into the west of Ireland. Now, this isn't an attack on the Ukrainians, far from it. Despite the extraordinary sacrifices and the devastation to local tourism economies, Irish people were actually largely supportive of these measures. It was Ireland's Wearschaff in that moment. However, what started out with the best of intentions and a sense of national unity turned sour when locals realised that the Ukrainians were being cycled out of the private accommodation market, and the hotels which were promised to return to the communities along with their livelihoods, were not returned. Instead, Arab and African men were cycled in. And with this change in policy came a strengthening in tone of no veto, no consultation from the state. And international protection centres began to burn. But this was a spark 20 years in the making. Ireland's Celtic Tiger boom, economic boom at the turn of the millennium, coincided with an explosion in bogus asylum claims, largely from Nigeria and other African nations. As early as 2005, Ireland's Justice Minister, Michael McDowell, admitted that 90% of asylum claims to that point were unfounded or fake. Yet no mass state-supervised deportations followed. By not deporting those who arrived into Ireland at the beginning of the millennium, the government set a precedent. Ireland was marked out as a soft touch, and fake asylum claims have risen exponentially over the past 25 years. So in 2017, there were just under 3,000 asylum claims in tiny Ireland, 4 million people in 2005. By 2023, there were more than 13,000. Absurdly, under political pressure in 2025, current Prime Minister Micheál Martin stated that in 2024, 65% of asylum applications were rejected in the first instance. This would rise significantly later on. And in January 2025, 80% of asylum applications were rejected. Again, no mass deportations have followed. Martin, the leader of the country, threw up his hands as though he and his party weren't responsible for this mess. And it is a mess. For 2 decades, successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments have claimed that Ireland's asylum system has been under control and that everyone entering the country was well vetted using fingerprinting and EU database cross-checking. This was exposed as a lie in January 2024 when Ireland's then Justice Minister Helen McEntee was confronted about her department's de facto open borders politics by several independent politicians. When she was pressed to make a statement on the verification process of asylum applications, she said, quote, "This is our Justice Minister. As a first step, all applicants are photographed and fingerprinted. These fingerprints are then checked against the Eurodac database." And many of you will know, Eurodac is an EU-wide immigration database which stores the fingerprints of asylum applicants, so it can be cross-checked to see who has crossed borders illegally. However, one of the few investigative journalists in Ireland, Niamh Bhríon, followed up on the Justice Minister's claims and found that between 2015 and 2023, no Irish authority had ever accessed Eurodac for the purposes of investigating serious crime. When another independent minister asked how many asylum applicants' fingerprints were checked against Europol, she responded that the Irish police do not input asylum claimants' fingers into Europol. The point is, no meaningful vetting of asylum claimants to Ireland have been performed in the past 20 years. And it gets even worse than that. It further transpired in 2022 and 2023 alone. Nearly 9,000 individuals presented at Dublin airport seeking asylum with no or falsified documents, with only one case being prosecuted. And in those same years, 2022 and 2023, the majority of asylum claims, 27,000 in total, came from non-EU countries, predominantly Africa. And again, when pushed, the Justice Minister admitted that no meaningful background checks were carried out on non-EU applicants either. Again, to quote her, "It would be in breach of our responsibilities in respect of refugee protection to contact the consular authorities, as doing so may have the consequence of making such authorities aware of an applicant's presence in the state and their claim for international protection." These exchanges simply proved what many Irish had long suspected. Ireland is a de facto open border state. And the masses of single men who have been forced into small, ancient, close-knit communities around Ireland are entirely unvetted and entirely unknown entities. Despite this, successive leaders, beginning with then Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, adopted this ruthless policy of no consultation with local communities and no veto on behalf of the communities when busing these immigrants in with drop-offs, as I said, often happening in the dead of night. Now, these are the circumstances that have led to violent confrontations in towns such as Newtown, Mount Kennedy, where police pepper sprayed and baton charged locals, as well as in Clonmel and Coolock. Most recently, before Christmas, a riot erupted outside of Ireland's largest asylum hotel in Dublin after a 10-year-old girl was allegedly raped by an African asylum seeker on the grounds of the hotel. When an Algerian immigrant stabbed a 3-year-old outside a school in central Dublin in November 2023, it ignited a riot which saw mass civil disobedience, buses and police vehicles set alight, and scenes previously thought unimaginable. And I had certainly witnessed nothing like it in my lifetime. And that particular riot made news headlines around the world. So if Ireland was then to descend into a kinetic civil war or an outpouring of mass civil disobedience, I would say this, Professor Betts, it's undoubtedly that, in my mind, it'll be sparked by the authoritarianism of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael enforcing unknown and unvetted men that they know are making false asylum claims into small, close-knit communities. But there's other simmering issues also. Since the 1960s, the Irish economy has been focused on attracting foreign direct investment, largely from pharmaceutical and tech multinationals from the USA. Up until the mid-1990s, this worked relatively well. And by 1996, Ireland had achieved full employment. Rather than cool international investment at that point, the big two parties, again, self-proclaimed centrists, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, ramped up foreign direct investment. A 12.5% corporation tax, significantly lower than our EU neighbours, was fully implemented in 2003, and that made Ireland an attractive base of operations for US multinationals looking to avoid paying non-US taxes. The demand for jobs skyrocketed, and to meet it, successive governments imported over 1 million people between 2000 and 2025, turning Ireland from one of Europe's most homogenous countries into one in which almost 1/4 of all people are now born overseas, all in the space of just 25 years. So one of the most critical effects this massive population explosion has had has been to lead to the worst housing crisis in the history of the state. At present, 40% of employed, not unemployed, not general, 40% of employed young Irish people between the ages of 20 and 35 live in their parental home. That's in stark contrast. So just to give you an example, in Germany and France, that number is 12% of young people living at home. And in Sweden, it's 2%. So 40% of Irish people are being forced to live at home despite working. As a May 2024 report by Eurofound reported that 61% of all young Irish people between the ages of 15 and 29 were either planning to migrate or wish to migrate to another country within 3 years. This is the highest figure for any EU nation. So Irish young people, more than any other EU nation, want out of their home country. So added to this injustice that young people feel in not being able to afford a home is the fact that the government's poor handling of the FDI economy that is attracting multinationals, which native population worker pool cannot service, has led to work visas being handed out to highly paid tech and health graduates from non-EU nations, largely India. Official statistics show that Ireland is importing Indians at a rate of about 2,000 per month. Again, tiny Ireland. Many of them going into highly paid tech and health jobs. As such, they are able to have their pick of properties in Ireland's urban areas, while working Irish are locked up in their childhood bedrooms. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have imported a ready-made Indian upper middle class who take up a privileged position in Irish society immediately upon entering the country. They are currently arriving in such numbers that aside from becoming an instant elite in Irish society, they'll feel no pressure to integrate into Irish society because they can form self-sustaining micro-communities. And this is a recipe for resentment and long-term ethnic tensions. At present, there's a growing sense amongst Irish people that government is firmly on the side of immigrants who they need to keep their FDI economic expansion afloat. And as people grow more vocal in their opposition to mass immigration, with polls consistently showing that at least 70% of the population of Ireland want a reduction in immigration, the government responds by clamping down on online speech and supposed hate crimes. So, to get to the point, will the Irish rise up in violent rebellion against the state? Unlikely. And here's why. Ireland has remained docile and passive during the past two, and I should say outside of a spark caused by reckless immigration policies. I'm talking now more long-term, perhaps. Ireland has remained docile and passive during the past 2 decades of change, and the biggest reason for this is immigration. More than 1 million Irish people have left the nation since the foundation of the state. Immigration has always been Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's emergency relief valve in tough economic times. During the 1950s, after Eamon de Valera's failed protectionist experiment, and again in the 1980s after a failure to adapt to global recession, and again after the collapse of the Celtic Tiger and our bailout by the European Commission, the IMF, and the European Central Bank in 2010, waves of young Irish people left for familiar territory in the UK, Canada, Australia, and America. That exodus of young, virile, and energetic people siphons off the anger that they take with them. The anger at being let down by poor economic management, by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the anger of being forced to leave their communities and nation, the anger of being seen as disposable. There cannot be a kinetic civil war in Ireland while its youngest and most virile are forced abroad generation after generation. More importantly, there can also be no systematic change to the political ruling class, when those who have been most betrayed by the big two in Irish politics, as well as Sinn Féin, who have offered no political opposition or an alternative vision for Ireland, are forced out of the country, where they lose their right to vote and participate in the future of Ireland. Ireland's most energetic, angry, and conscious of the problems facing the nation are forced to either forget Ireland entirely or simmer angrily abroad. For a new Ireland to arise, the most angry must remain. Quite a task for a nation with centuries of emigration encoded into its psyche. As such, there will be, at least in the medium term, there'll be no grand romantic uprising. There'll be no reenactment of 1916. Instead, Ireland will have to endure what the rest of Western Europe has endured for the past number of decades. A steady rise in violent crime, sexual assault and murder, already evident in official data, and a breakdown in high-trust communities. As the Irish government has made no effort to break up ethnic and religious groups when forcing them into small communities around the country, Ireland will have to endure inter-ethnic conflict related to drugs, gang, and social and economic discrepancies amongst integrated groups and between unintegrated groups and natives. In 25 short years, Ireland has followed the rest of Western Europe in making the same mistakes that they made in their initial waves of immigration policy decades ago. And so Ireland's social collapse, our path out, is linked to how other Western European nations also handle the issue. Step one, in my opinion, must be for Ireland to develop a strong populist right party and identity. What makes Ireland somewhat unique is the narrowness of our political axis, our left-right political axis. While opposition parties like Sinn Féin are explicit and determined socialists, the big two, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have almost no ideological grounding. They are floating parties who shift to where the EU tells them to shift and where they see votes can be picked up at any given time at home. That ideological vacuousness has pulled them further and further left over the past 2 decades, towards those like Sinn Féin with principles. A recently released analysis of party manifestos in Ireland's political parties, how Ireland voted 2024, found that all major parties are left-wing in Ireland, with the editor of that, Professor Eoin O'Malley, stating that Ireland's political landscape was, quote, among Europe's most left-wing. Ireland then needs a populist right party and a movement in the style of Sweden Democrats and her successful cousins in France, in Germany, Hungary, Italy, and elsewhere. Ireland needs to establish a right-wing beachhead in Europe's most left-wing nation. It is the only deterrent against Ireland's social decline and possible descent into civil war.